I would like to begin day 2, Social Behavior and Emotions, with Mark Bekoff and talking about the best thing ever, play.
Thank you, Prescott, and welcome to all the international people and to the people I can't see in the audience because of the sunlight. I left my sunscreen at home. So today I'm going to talk about the moral lives of animals and why social play is so important to understand. When I started my graduate work with Mike Fox, I remember I said I wanted to study play in various canids, and there were 2 responses. The first was that play is a garbage pail into which everybody tosses behavior patterns that they can't understand. That's because they never bothered trying to study them. And also that you never want to work on domestic dogs, because really years ago, a lot of people said domestic dogs were just artifacts due to domestication, and that we couldn't learn much about other animals by studying domestic dogs. Veterinarians could do it, and those people interested in applied animal behavior can do it. But really, if you go back and you look at the literature in ethology, for example, you don't find much at all until Mike Fox started studying dogs and other canids. What is this? Oh, yeah, thank you. How do you do this again? Which is okay, great. So a quick review for those of you who weren't here yesterday, but once again, I used Nico Tinbergen's, and Darwin, come on. Nico Tinbergen's sort of scheme for studying animal behavior, where we ask questions about evolution, adaptation, causation, ontogeny, and then I toss in Gordon Burghart's ideas about private and subjective experience. And so with respect to play, we would just say, what's play good for? Why did it evolve? How does it help individuals adapt to their social or other situations? What causes play? How does play develop? And what does it feel like when animals play? And we can ask very solid theoretical questions, and the database is actually accumulating rapidly into the subject of animal play, crossing different species and going across mammals, birds, and perhaps fish. And then Gordon Burghart has some interesting observations of a turtle playing with a basketball, probably because the turtle was just bored out of his mind being in captivity. But I'm going to concentrate on social play. So when I talk about play today, I'm going to talk about social play. And once again, I'm going to argue just using ideas from Darwin's theory of evolutionary continuity, that once again, the bumper sticker is, if we have something, other animals have it too, but we shouldn't be looking for like an exact or isomorphic match. So play is really important. A couple years ago, the New York Times had a cover story on why do we play. And what's really been neat for me is I study play in non-human animals, but over the last couple of years, developmental psychologists, principals in schools, teachers have asked the question of what can we learn from non-human animals about human play? Because it's happening now in schools across the world, not only in North America, is that play is kind of a luxury. You play when you have time after you sit on your butt all day in class, being bored out of your mind, looking at computer screens. And teachers and school administrators are very concerned. So I always say that we should let human children be the animals who they are. And they need to play, and they need to play spontaneously, not stuff that's pre-planned, like soccer at 4, tennis at 5, gymnastics at 6, violin at 7, and then you've got a toasted kid at the end of the day. And part of the reason that teachers are really interested is not only for the exercise component, because there's so many fat kids, is also because the fact that during play, they learn social skills. How to play, how to resolve conflict. And so I think that I'm hoping that there's a real change. And the important point for, say, this meeting but is much of what we've learned about play comes from studies of dogs, domestic dogs, and their wild relatives. And a lot of the early work is serving for models of play that's being, studies that are being conducted on a wide variety of species. Oh, I gotta figure this puppy out, okay? So I wrote about it in a book called Wild Justice with my colleague Jessica Pierce, and we're happy it's been translated into a lot of languages, including Arabic, which really blew my mind, actually. But there are a bunch of people now in the Emirates who are very interested in animal behavior. And I wrote a kid's book called Animals at Play, and I show this early on because if you really want to skip all the details, but you want to read a factual account of play, you can do it in 28 pages and I think 700 words. So, but I'm quite serious about it because it lays out what we call the rules of the game of how different animals play. These are kind of universal rules that you see in play across species. Darwin observed play, wrote about it, talked about play and happiness, and even considered perhaps that insects play, ants chasing and pretending to bite one another. I'll leave the door open as to whether insects play. There are some observations of ants playing, well, the person calls it playing with their antennae. It's not quite sure if that's play. So I'm going to focus today on play in mammals, although the play in birds is just really being demonstrated across the board. These are just some questions that I motivate. This is kind of like a work in progress. I'm very interested in the notion of fair play, and I'll be talking a lot about that in a bit. But, is there a moral gap? Like people arguing that we are the only moral animals, which, just listen to the news this morning and you'll see that we are not moral animals necessarily, and we're surely not the only moral animals. Is there evolutionary continuity? Do other animals have the cognitive and emotional capacities that are needed for morality? Do they forgive and forget? I know you can read this. Are primates special? People who study non-human primates tend never to cite comparative literature. That's changing a bit, but they act as if primates are the only show in town. And really what we know, we've known this forever from the work of Tinbergen, Hans Kruk, who studied hyenas, George Schaller, who did a lot of work early in the 60s and the 70s, that if we want to understand the evolution of sociality in humans, we should be looking to the social carnivores, not necessarily to the non-human primates and the great apes. And we need to know the details of how animals interact with one another in social situations. Like I said, that's one of the reasons why we didn't know much about play, and people wrote off play as being an unimportant topic or one that you couldn't study. Or like I said, there were some people who said it was just a garbage pail into which we dumped stuff that we could not understand. So one of the big paradigm shifts that's happening now is that across the board we're learning that the individuals of many, many different species are predominantly prosocial cooperative, or you could say empathic. And here are some of the data, and I've just highlighted them. And you can see that the numbers are high in terms of the percentage of behavior that is positively affiliative, or what we call prosocial, cooperative. And it's a real paradigm shift, mainly due to misreadings of Darwin and others. And that is, we're not saying animals don't fight with one another. They do fight with one another, and they do on occasion harm one another. So one of the things that popular press and people say is, well, Jane Goodall observed warfare in chimpanzees. Well, yeah, she observed it once in 50 years. But blood sells, and the popular media likes to push that. You turn on the news and you'll read about some horrific murder or assault in humans, and they'll say the people were behaving like animals. And so what's really exciting for me is that evolutionary biologists are really looking at cooperation and fairness now in its own right. In other words, neither of those sorts of behaviors evolved as byproducts or sideshows to competition. And that survival of the fittest means a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily mean survival of the most dominant or most aggressive animals. And one of the things, I'm just saying this on the side because I do talk a lot to dog teachers or dog trainers, is the fact that dominance is not a myth. There's been some articles over the last few years, a couple written by a dog trainer in New York who says dominance is a myth. Non-human animals don't dominate one another. Well, of course they dominate one another. It's just due to an egregious misunderstanding of the concept of dominance. You don't have to dominate by actively beating someone up. There's many ways to control or influence the behavior of other animals. And when you look at the evolution of threat signals, submissive signals, appeasement signals across species, there's really a good reason why non-human animals don't want to fight, especially wild animals, and that is, if you fight, you can get hurt. So I can beat you up and be the dominant animal and get hurt, and that can compromise my own reproductive fitness, or I could get injured, or there's no one there to take me to the vet. So I'm just putting this forth because I think it's really important that this paradigm shift be appreciated. And this is just a couple of books, a handful of books that have been published, some recently, but of course, Frans de Waal's been saying this for ages, but these are just books that have been published over the last couple of years on the importance of cooperation. And this is in humans too. There's some really great cross-cultural data that Martin Nowak at Harvard has accumulated in this book called Super Cooperators that shows across cultures there is what people are beginning to call a fairness instinct. And there's a book coming out in a few months called The Fairness Instinct. So people are getting on it. An unbelievably good book is one by Daka Keltner, who's a psychologist at University of California in Berkeley, called Born to Be Good. And I published my book, The Animal Manifesto, at about the same time that he published Born to Be Good. And we didn't know one another, but we've actually met now over email, because you don't meet anybody in person anymore. But actually, we've really discussed a lot of these things. And it's really interesting where he wrote about humans, you could have put non-human animals, and vice versa in my book. And he, not surprisingly, he was a student of Paul Ekman, who did a lot of work on facial expressions in humans, taking a strongly Darwinian point of view. So once again, just to keep you up on Saturday, we talked about what are these animals doing. One question that comes up, and I don't have an answer for it, but people have been talking about it, is grieving and mourning sort of a subset of moral behavior? We know now that mice, chickens, and rats display empathy. And people go, oh, those are just stories. Well, if they're stories, they were published in peer-reviewed journals such as Science and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So I kind of use that as a litmus test for whether these data are real. Some people know here the work of Jaak Panksepp at Washington State University, who has demonstrated very clearly that rats laugh and like to be tickled. And although I don't like the methods he uses because they're intensely violent and invasive, and I'm saying that openly because Jaak and I have talked about it, his papers are published in Science magazine and other prestigious journals. Okay? So I say that because I get really pissed off when people say, oh, well, those are just feelings you have. Rats don't really like being tickled. They don't really play. Well, they do. So we either accept those data or we decide that journals in which some of my colleagues would give an arm to publish one paper in their career are really just like publishing in the National Enquirer. So the other side of the coin, and I'm not going to talk about it today, is can animals be bad or evil? Well, I suppose they can. If they can be good and fair and empathic and cooperative and kind, then sure they can be bad or evil. But predators are not evil. People say, well, wolves kill elk. Well, they do kill elk, but that's the only way that they can survive. Do I like it? No. If I were a grand designer, would I design animals to be like that? No. But we can't use the fact that other animals harm other animals for justifying the harm that we cause to other animals. It's just a major category error, as philosophers call it, and using predation is just wrong. So once again, do chimpanzees occasionally harm and kill one another? Yeah, but it's really, really rare. Do foxes sometimes surplus kill chickens? Yeah, but it's really, really rare. So I don't want to be misquoted as saying animals are always nice to one another, non-human animals are always nice to one another, because they're not. This is actually a picture of a crocodile in Masai Mara who beheaded a zebra in front of my own eyes in under a minute. So people go, well, he was nasty, or she. Well, yeah, maybe, but that's how crocodiles eat. So, why study social play in detail? And one of the reasons I got really interested in it was that it is this kaleidoscope of behavior. I mean, you see behavior patterns from all different contexts, like dominance, aggression, mating, and predation. It's also a voluntary activity. And one of the important things about play is that animals have the right to quit. If I don't want to play, I can stop. And invariably, it's honored. Once again, people go, well, no, when I go to dog parks, play always escalates into aggression. Well, I've studied that, and maybe 2 to 4%, depending on the individuals. Sometimes never between certain individuals. So play is a voluntary activity, and it requires cooperation and fairness, on ongoing negotiations, apologies, forgiveness. I'll show you a video soon about all of these things. And then the question is how do animals know they're playing, and how likely and how are they able to keep on playing? And we've seen a number of different, if you will, evolutionary strategies. The first would be there are play signals, there are honest signals. Once again, people sometimes say, yeah, when I go to the dog park, dogs always invite my dog to play, and then they try to beat him up or mate with her or do something. It's actually very rare. We actually collected data on it. Role reversal, dominant animals allow themselves to be dominated. They may roll over on their back. They may allow themselves to be chased. In chimpanzees, a good sign of play is when a real high-ranking animal allows himself or herself to be chased. Self-handicapping, animals don't bite as hard as they can. They don't slam into one another as hard as they can. And the sequences of play are highly variable. And one idea is that animals know they're playing because they have this expectation built in that sequences are going to be relatively stereotyped. And some of you may know the name Bob Fagan, a very well-known evolutionary and mathematical biologist. And Bob actually analyzed some of the data that we collected over the years. And in fact, statistically, play sequences are significantly more highly variable than non-play sequences. And actually, if you ask kids in a playground, or you ask humans, like, how did you know I was playing, or how did you know it was play? They'll often say, oh, well, because if you were seriously trying to mate with me or dominate me or eat me if you're a cannibal, you would have performed a certain set sequence of behaviors, okay? So these are some of the mechanisms that have evolved. The other thing is, animals don't necessarily play all that much. Domestic dogs do, but in the wild, ungulates play around 10% of the time. In our field work of coyotes, young coyotes play between like 2 to 5% of the time. And I just got an email from a woman in Italy who is working on captive wolves, and they play around 10% of the time. So the important thing here is that play is really important, but it's not a behavior pattern that occurs all that frequently. There are great data from the field in think it's vervet monkeys, that show, in fact, that play is very much dependent on ecological conditions. When there's a lot of food, mother vervets allow their young to play more than when there isn't food. And there's also laissez-faire mothers who basically let their young do anything, and more restrictive mothers who are control freaks and don't let their kids play at all. So it's a very complicated situation. Among wild coyotes and wolves, you see a lot of play. You'll see parents or kids. Oh, what did I do? Did I do that? Oh, okay. You'll see parents or adults sometimes interfere with the play. So it's a very complex situation, but the fact of the matter is we have enough data to show that play is very important. Why it has evolved, one of Tim Bergen's questions, what's it good for? I didn't do that. What? Can you all see this one? Okay. So there's a number of different theories, and the take-home message here is that not one theory or one reason for play applies to all species in which play has been observed. But the first would be it's important in social development. Animals learn communication skills. They learn what's right and what's wrong. It's important in physical development. We have what's called the training response, the development of bones, muscles, tendons, and joints. And John Byers, who was one of my first PhD students years ago at the University of Colorado, wrote a number of really good papers showing that play in mammals occurs during the most rapid differentiation of cells in the cerebellum postnatally. He's also did a really classic study on captive animals at the Brookfield Zoo, where 50% of the enclosure was flat and 50% of the enclosure was really tricky, mountainous, as you could make in a zoo. And the ibex, he studied Siberian ibex, preferred to play 80% of the time in the high-risk environment, i.e. on the cliffs, and 20% on the flat. This is their choice. They could have done 50-50, or in fact, some people predicted that they would play where it was more safely. Joel Berger, who was another one of my first graduate students, did his dissertation on the development of play in 3 different locations where bighorn sheep lived, and found remarkable differences in terms of the nature of play, how the young bighorn sheep played when there were cactuses and a very dry environment right outside of Palm Springs, California, and how they play differently when they were in British Columbia. And having seen young bighorn sheep run headfirst into cholla cactus, it's not a good situation. I mean, it hurts, obviously. So they really learn how to play very differently in different habitats. Play can be important in aerobic and anaerobic training. You might see long-distance running, if you will, like a marathon, and you might see these short interval bursts. You go, you stop, you go, you stop. It may be important in cognitive development and training, which John argued years ago with respect to the data that he collected on the Siberian ibex. And a theory that I put forth with a man named Marek Spinka. Some of you may know he's done wonderful work on pigs in Czechoslovakia. A woman named Ruth Newberry at Washington State University, is that play is important for training for the unexpected. And we put this theory together to see if we could come up with a grand theory of why play has evolved across very different species. And this function of play, if you will, came out to be pretty robust. And if you think of the nature of play sequences being unpredictable and having unexpected turns, this just might be it. And there are actually some human developmental psychologists, well, they're human, they're developmental psychologists who study humans, I know, I hate that, who actually argue the same. And when they look at kids playing, they see it as a very adaptive response. And it turns out that many serial killers or psychopaths, when they do retrospective studies, teachers, peers, siblings, parents will say that so-and-so did not know how to play spontaneously, or when play occurred, they didn't know how to play and then resolve the conflicts that arose in play. There's a psychiatrist named Stuart Brown, if you're interested, who's done really wonderful work looking at the relationship of play and these egregious crimes that have occurred. So I want to show the video now. What do I do? What's that? That's it. One more time with what? Oh. No. Okay. There's sound, too.
The essence of social play is trust. Every playmate must feel assured that it's safe, that the other animal intends no harm. Humans rely on nearly 6,000 languages to communicate friendly intentions, while animals seem to do very well without any words at all. The nature of play is that it closely resembles many other activities in an animal's life. During each play bout, youngsters may practice a variety of survival skills. Pretend mating might be followed by running away, followed by mock fighting, and then, of course, some more pretend mating. In this kaleidoscope of activity, the players need to reassure each other that they're being invited to romp rather than challenged to fight. So they tell each other with signals. It's the language of play.
Play signals are an interesting thing to look at because in animals who are closely related, like coyotes, wolves, and dogs, and foxes, they're pretty much the same play signals. You see the play bow, you see the pawing, you see this sort of high amplitude running gait. And the reason that they're all the same is because they have to be very obvious, very clear play signals. They can't yell, "Come play with me." So the way they yell, "Come play with me," is they do a play bow. There's always a chance that play signals will be misunderstood, and then play could grade into fighting, and that's a risk. But in many species, play signals are unique to play. They're very unambiguous and very clear, but there always is the risk. But that's probably part of why play is so carefully negotiated, is because it could be risky and have it break into aggression.
Having lived with dogs for thousands of years, humans can easily tell when they're playing. Dogs have even taught us how to signal in their language. But as an expert in animal behavior, Dr. Mark Beckoff has made a specific study of play communication.
Right now, this is wrestling. This is role reversal. This is classic. Izzy could clearly nail Parker, but he trusts that Parker won't bite him and won't do anything to disturb the rules of the game. And if you notice, Izzy's taking Parker's legs in his mouth. When he could snap that leg off in a heartbeat, but he won't do it. When animals play, you have to look at the whole body. A wagging tail in and of itself may not mean anything. It may mean the animal's excited. But when you combine the wagging tail and the ears are up a bit, and the animal's walking in a very light gait and goes woof, like that, then that's play. Unmistakably play. I think one of the things that people don't realize, that if you want to understand animal play, is you got to film it and you got to watch it frame by frame, because you need the details. When you do the analyses frame by frame, you'll see that they're continually adjusting their behavior. There'll be real quick eye contact. Izzy might do something that Parker doesn't like, and Izzy will tell him stop doing it with his eyes. You'll see that they orient so that the bites don't grab a loose lip. If you notice, they never bite the eye. They don't yank at the ears very much. And they're making continual micro adjustments when they play. So what we're seeing now is classic mutual symmetrical wrestling play. This is as good as it gets for dogs. I think people ought to do this more.
Dolphins can't communicate their intention to play exactly as dogs do. With their permanent smiles, they always look playful. But looks can be deceiving. Dolphin playing and fighting are very similar. So they depend on subtle differences in gestures to know whether an action is playful or deadly. Dr. Kathleen Dudzinski is an expert in dolphin communication.
When dolphins are playing, they'll use a lot of the same signals as they use when they're fighting. But when they're playing, they modify those signals with different angles of approach from behind or from the side. When they're fighting, there'll be head-to-head angles of approach, very direct, very harsh movements. Also, when dolphins are playing, there's a lot of affectionate rubbing. But when they're fighting, there's no affectionate rubbing. Dolphins are strong animals. They're 200 to 300 pounds. They have a lot of sharp teeth. You know, they could hurt each other. They could kill each other. So they need a place that's safe to learn how to use these signals. It's play.
Feeling safe when you play is very important, especially when you're interacting with an animal who can beat you up. So that safety comes from trust. Play a little, you test one another out, you assess one another, and then you go, oh gee, even if I bite them, they'll play. Or even if I mount them, they'll play. So that safety factor is critical. So if you feel unsafe and you're stressed, you could predict that the animal won't play.
Tigawak, a 17-month-old polar bear, is not all that playful. Born at the Brookfield Zoo just outside of Chicago, she had such severe medical problems that zookeepers were forced to take her from her mother in order to save her life. Although she's now the picture of physical health, Tigawak has emotional challenges. She's never known another bear and never learned the joy of play. 14-month-old Eddie, on the other hand, is a master of play. Eddie was also born in a zoo, but he was raised by his mother. He was flown to Brookfield Zoo to be a companion to Tigawak and to teach her to play. This is their first encounter. Zookeepers know that if Tigawak refuses to play, she may never learn how to act with other bears and probably will never breed. The days wear on, but Eddie doesn't give up on the reluctant Tigawak. Still, the only thing she's playing is hard to get. When Eddie's personal charm seems to fail, he brings gifts. Using objects to solicit play is a classic animal strategy. Dogs might use a stick, but a captive zoo bear offers his toys. All of his toys. Eddie holds nothing back. He tries another classic ploy, the play bow. But Tigawak does not speak the language of play, and she rejects him again. Well then, perhaps a swim. It's possible that Tigawak's early traumas and play deprivation have left too deep a scar for her to ever play. But then, by running away from Tigawak, Eddie cleverly engages her in a game of chase. It's another classic in the vocabulary of play. Tigawak is finally learning the language. Only true play partners will engage in play fighting. knowing they won't be hurt. Play has conquered Tigawak's fears. Through Eddie's gentle persistence, shameless groveling, and natural talents in the art of play, Tigawak has been transformed into a social animal, a friend, a player.
So, yeah, they're good. I'll just leave this for a second. Yeah, so there's a number of messages here. In the dog play sequences, you could see that Taylor weighed about 100 pounds, Parker weighed 20. They were good friends. And I mean, not once in countless hours of watching them play was there even any hint of any kind of escalation into a really, say, aggressive encounter. And the other message is the importance of playing these films back frame by frame. Michael Fox will remember when he told me this is what I had to do for my dissertation. I almost beat the hell out of him. But, well, I mean, seriously, you know, you film an hour of play, and at the time, we didn't have digitizing equipment, really. So it could just take a week to analyze an hour of play. So I would put out notices, anybody want to study play in, these were captive animals, you know, coyotes, wolves, foxes, and dogs, and everybody wanted to do it until they were stuck in a dark room with a projector that they had to advance frame by frame. But we really needed the details, and like I said before, that's one of the reasons why people kind of wrote play off, because, you know, this was sort of classical ethology that was European stamp collecting. A lot of people, you know, referred to ethology as stamp collecting, of course, until Tinbergen and Lorenz and von Frisch won the Nobel Prize. The dolphins are interesting because you can see that they don't have particularly expressive faces or bodies. So one of the ways they play is by the method of approach, a side approach rather than a head-on approach. And the Tigawak and Eddie story is a good one. Don't take this as any kind of support for keeping animals in zoos or shipping them around. I mean, this sort of made the best of a horrible situation because Tigawak was born to make money at the Brookfield Zoo. She got sick. They had to take her from her mother. She didn't socialize because she never had the opportunity to interact with another bear. And Eddie was flown in, you know, like he was a couch, moved from here to there as a play partner. Well, you know, like I said, that's the best of a terrible situation. But you could see the transition for Tigawak becoming a player. She had no socialization. She didn't know bear talk or bear speak, if you will. And Eddie was persistently trying to get her to play because animals like to play. And he brought her toys, like dogs bring bones or treats to other dogs. And finally, he got her to play by running away. So what happened, and one of the things that you see in play is that it really has to occur in a pretty stress-free environment. So Tigawak got the confidence. And then you could see the transition over time that she played, and then they started going from chase play to interactive play, and then actually soon after they were engaging in wrestling play. So just a few slides, because sometimes the video doesn't work, but it'll make the points I'm trying to make. These are wildebeest in the Gorogoro crater. I watched them play, I mean, when I say violent, I mean in a negative way, but they really play in an incredibly energetic way, and they could just destroy one another with the tips of their horns, and they don't. Rhinos play. This little baby was looking for a play partner, and his mother would go around like she was on a turret trying to watch him or her play. But it was just incredible to just see this animal, just all that he wanted to do was play. Elephants play. They'll basically do a very well choreographed dance. They'll put the trunk on the top of another elephant. They'll lock tusks. I watched this for 4 hours, and everyone else in the van decided to go back to the lodge and drink margaritas. But it was really amazing to watch them negotiate this play. And this is another picture of them. I don't know how to turn it over. Elephants don't roll over on their backs. So I'm learning PowerPoint, and I hope to flip it someday. Dogs, once again, just different behaviors. This was a dog named Moses. Tika, you wouldn't know from a snapshot whether they were playing or whether they were actually fighting. These are two dogs playing in front of the Vatican, and it actually turned into a little humping sequence, which we all thought was kind of interesting where it was taking place. The acrobatics, I know some of you have seen this, but one of the things that I really learned is that a lot of people who work with dogs have never really studied, if you will, video. I mean, you watch dogs, but you really get a lot out of studying the video. You can see the amazing acrobatics. They could land very funny and twist a leg or a shoulder. And once again, by looking at these, you can study the different actions, you can study the form, the duration of the actions, and get a lot of information on how animals change their behaviors in different contexts. So one of the ways we did this, these are just shots from video. And we would analyze them frame by frame. Of course, if you know the film speed, you know how long a particular action is performed, and you might, as a lot of classical ethologists, they'll use the duration of an act as a measure of intensity. These are wild coyotes playing. There's, once again, if you came across these two animals and you just took a snapshot, you might think that this is, a strongly dominant, interaction or a fight, but no, they were playing and they were rolling around. That's trust. You saw the bears yesterday. One of the markers about bears, and I've heard a lot of people who work with dogs, ask me or basically tell me that, you can look at the well-being of an individual by the absence or the presence of play. So people will have very playful dogs and they stop playing, and immediately you think something's wrong, and it probably is. So play, there are some people in the UK studying play as a marker of well-being, and you saw the bears. These are all bears who were tortured relentlessly for years, decade and a half, sometimes 3 decades, and we look at play as being a marker of their rehabilitation. And you can actually begin to see physiologically as well. The vets will take different measures, blood levels of certain chemicals and things like that, heart rate, and you'll see as they begin to play, there's, who knows the cause and effect, but play is important. Now, what are some of the actions that are used to initiate play? These are across canids, but a lot of species show bowing, these exaggerated approaches, approach withdrawals, face pawing, very subtle head and eye movements, these high amplitude leaps, and barking. And Alexandra Horowitz has looked at the attention-getting barking in play. There's a bow. There's an example from lions. So once again, the interesting thing about play signals is they're an example of what we call in ethology ritualized signals. They become very, very clear. When we studied the form of play bows, they're extremely stereotyped. And one of Conrad Lorenz's contributions to ethology was he talked about what he called fixed action patterns. And these were actions that occurred in almost a very invariable or stereotype form. And then George Barlow, who some of you may have heard of, a very well-known ethologist who studied fish, came up with the concept of modal action patterns, because very few actions are really performed perfectly or exactly the same each time. So play bows would be examples of modal actions. We recognize them and other animals recognize them. And there would be just a picture of a play bow, and we would, so what we could do is we could measure them. This is a very old slide, but it shows we could look at this distance that the shoulders are declined, say off of a horizontal, and then by counting frames, we could measure the duration. And basically we found that they're very stereotyped. And one interesting finding was that play bows performed at the beginning of a sequence are less variable or more stereotyped than bows performed during a play encounter. And this can be explained as a number of ways. It could be, I want to play with you and I have to make my intentions clear, so I do a very clear signal. Of course, while I'm playing, I may go into a play bow from standover, from rolling over, so you would expect some more variability. But the play bow is still recognizable, and I think that would be the important message here. Play bows can occur in lots of different places. They could occur just at the beginning, with, say, P is a play signal. They could be every 3 actions or every 3 seconds. They could come after an action or before an action, or they can just occur randomly. And what we discovered, for some reason these slides didn't load right, but I'm not going to worry about it. Basically what we discovered was that in young wolves, coyotes, and dogs in captivity, but we actually did some of this work in the field, that play signals are used in a very strategic way. They're used at the beginning of a play sequence to say, I want to play with you. That's basically the message. And then we looked at whether they followed or preceded particular actions that could be misinterpreted non-randomly. So we looked at hard biting with vigorous head shaking. And what we discovered was that play bows are used non-randomly. They're used when an animal is going to jump up and bite, say, the shoulder or the body of another animal and just vigorously shake their head. And they're also used after that happens. And so the message there basically is, I'm going to bite you, mount you, but it's still play. Or, I'm sorry I did it. Because often what happens when you look at the film, but you also see it when you just look at dogs or wolves or coyotes or other animals playing, is that I'm playing with you and you bite me really hard and I recoil, I cock my head, I open my eyes, I do some behavior that says, well, wait a second, I thought we had agreed to play and now you're not playing. And then a bow immediately occurs to say, I apologize, I'm sorry, forgive me. The interesting thing that we found also was when you look at the development of behavior in wolves, dogs, and coyotes, young coyotes are much more aggressive right out of the, this study was done in captivity, but we have data from the wild. Oftentimes before wild coyotes emerge, you can hear growling and what you take to be fighting in the den. And the data that we collected in captivity shows that this probably is occurred. We know this for red foxes as well. And one of the interesting things is when you look at the data, coyotes are much more careful to negotiate play than are wolves, young wolves or young dogs. So there's this kind of aggressive atmosphere that prevails. And what happens in coyotes and red foxes, for example, is that they begin to form status relationships before they play, whereas in dogs and wolves, these relationships occur after they play. So this was just a good example of how comparative studies of play are very useful in learning about how animals communicate their intentions to play and how they maintain the play mood. So, because I like writing for children, this is an article I wrote for Ranger Rick. It took about as long to write as a scientific article because they have to fit it all into 2 pages. And there's basically 4 rules of play. You ask first, you be honest, you mind your manners, and you admit when you're wrong. And those rules, generally apply across species. What's exciting for me is that people are doing this work now on other animals other than canids and are discovering the same general rules of play and fairness. And also, these are pictures from early work that Mike Fox did on looking at facial expressions of different animals. So these are general facial expressions, 8 of them of red foxes, more in coyotes, and even more in wolves. And a hypothesis that we've put forth, and really it's a testable one, we have some data that support it, but really not even close to being conclusive, is that because there are more facial expressions, maybe wolves are able to communicate more subtle forms of communication than are other animals. I mean, we just don't know this, but it's a lovely, I think it's a good hypothesis to test. And once again, there are people who are interested in this in other species where you have closely related species that display different degrees of sociality. I mean, I know that red foxes can live in family groups, coyotes can live in packs like wolves. Wolves are typically pack-living animals, but in the wild, you see a lot of variation. In our studies of coyotes, you would see lone coyotes, you'd see animals as mated pairs or animals living in a pack, the same for wolves. But there is a general degree of sociality that's evolved in these animals where you can safely say on average wolves are more social than coyotes and coyotes are more social than red foxes. And once again, on Michael's work, you can see the differences in the faces. And then wonderful work done by Rudolf Schenkel in the late 40s was looking at tail positions of animals. These would be wolves. And I'm not saying that this is a complete ethogram of tail position, but once again, you can see that the situation gets really complex when you start factoring in body postures, you start factoring in facial expressions, tail positions, gait, and vocalizations. So I'm really excited that they're not my students, but there's a lot of students now doing work on play in the field and really collecting data that show very conclusively that across species, individuals work really hard to play fair. So, same slides. I want to just, how do I deaden this for a second? Bottom? Yeah. Yeah, so here's where we're going with this. And to me, it's really exciting. I was at a meeting in March in the Netherlands with Frans de Waal and a number of primatologists, including somebody who studied fish. As I started before, when I started, I was talking about the importance of cooperation and fairness and, if you will, prosocial behavior across species. And what's really exciting to me is that comparative data are supporting the fact that animals do behave in very fair and egalitarian ways, and you can kind of look at play as being a foundation of fairness. And I stress again that, yes, animals do fight, but it's very rare compared to these more egalitarian and fair interactions. And so I think that play is really, really the place to look for this. But now there is a lot of field workers who are studying non-human primates who are looking at grooming networks. They're looking at food sharing. People are looking at time and activity budgets in terms of, say, the contribution that individuals make to defending territory or defending food or defending nest sites. And what we're discovering is that there really is a lot of this equal behavior, if you will. And one of the pieces of information that we gleaned after 8 years in the field and about 5,000 hours of watching coyotes is as follows. We're lucky to have it. We didn't know we had it. I think one of the great things about studying animal behavior is that good old observation is really important. And if you keep your notebooks for decades, you could go back. So when we studied play years ago, and then we studied it in the wild, and we collected data here and there, we noticed this trend for this fair behavior. We noticed this trend that the animals were working really hard so that play could persist despite growling or mounting or swatting or biting and head shaking. So we looked at some of the data we had for wild coyotes and their methods of play. And here's what we found. If you accept the fact that play is important in the development and maintenance of social relationships, I don't think that's a debatable fact right now. We also had animals on occasion who didn't play fairly. It was rare, but they didn't play fairly. So we discovered a couple of things about these individuals when they were pups. They would try to play with other coyotes, but other coyotes would not accept their play bows, or they were avoided. They were just avoided. And what happened was they would be the likely animals to disperse from their natal group. So they leave their group. They were not forced out. And the reason this was important, because when we started collecting these data, and actually it persists a bit today, but it's with less vigor, animals often just leave their group of their own accord. It used to be thought that when you'd see wolves on their own or coyotes on their own, especially young animals, they were forced out of their groups. That's not necessarily the case. What happens is they don't bond. They're kind of ostracized, if you will. They leave. But what we discovered was that young coyotes around 7 to 9 months of age, when they left their group, they suffered 4 times higher mortality than young animals who stayed in their group. And if you go back and you think about Darwinian theory and you think of ideas about reproductive fitness, we began to pursue, and really, I can't say much more than suggesting, I think fairly strongly, that there's a fitness component to being fair. And that animals oftentimes, it would behoove them to play fairly and stay in their group, or else they will leave of their own accord. And there's very few corroborating data, but just last year, there was a study done on 40 years of demographic data in yellow-bellied marmots living in Crested Butte, outside of Crested Butte, Gotha, Colorado. There's a wonderful lab there called the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. And a very famous biologist named Ken Armitage began studies of marmots in the 60s. And one of my former undergraduates, who's now head of the Department of Biology at UCLA, Dan Blumstein, has continued these studies. And when they looked at over 40 years of data on the yellow-bellied marmots, they're seeing the exact same trends that we have seen in the coyotes, that play and social bonding is very important. And when animals leave their group, they're not necessarily driven out at all. They just decide, look, nobody loves me here, so I'm going to leave. So that, to me, is the big picture. So just summarizing, and I find it really exciting, is over the last decades, we've gone from play being thrown out as a garbage pail category of behavior to people seeing that it is a very important behavior, although it doesn't occur that often, if you will, as much as people think in the wild. I mean, after all, a lot of animals only mate once a year. So people say, well, these rare behaviors are not important. But no, I mean, that would just be ridiculous to say. And that you can use play to generate really big theories about the evolution of different forms of social behavior, reciprocity, fairness, what's right and wrong. You can call it moral behavior. We call it wild justice. And that the field is really rife for future studies. So thank you for listening to me on Saturday morning.